Okay, so we've talked this morning about how you really need to just keep asking questions, right? It's important to get as much clarity as you can. So when you're responding to questions, even if they're repetitive and redundant questions, you always want to keep answering explicitly and in detail. You want evidence-based responses. So what does that mean? Think like a lawyer, very factual, right? We did X on X day, or we served X number of clients in the last fiscal year. We served, you get the idea. Just be very factual. If you have a logic model, you want to explain the rationale behind it. You want to use proper terminology. And again, what did I say this morning? However they describe it is the way you're going to describe it, right? You may not really like those terms. Also, they might not quite fit, but if you can determine what they're after, because that's half the struggle again, right? Keep asking questions. You need to know that. If you can, obviously avoid dated terminology, because if your terminology is dated, what's the implication of that? That you're not current on the types of services or types of knowledge you need, right? And also, if there's some kind of new solution or terminology, make sure you explain that well enough so that they aren't wondering what it is. You want to always be connecting all the dots. You want everything really clear. Pretend you're explaining it to someone who doesn't know anything about it, right? Well, and there's a balance there too, but you just want to make sure that everyone who's evaluating it can read it. And which actually brings me to a point, is that never assume that everyone in an evaluation team is going to be a specialist in your area, right? Because they may have a government evaluation team, say it's a smallish one. The smallish one would be maybe 3 people, maybe it's 3 to 5 people. And you've got to think, who's going to be on that team? Who's going to be reading my proposal? And why do they have an uneven number? So there's no ties, right? So they will obviously have a contract specialist. They're going to have a subject, hopefully, we'll say a subject matter specialist, right? Someone who works in the line of work they're asking for. But they may also have someone who's a finance person. And sometimes there may be somebody, particularly those that are under a lot of scrutiny or political pressure, they may actually have someone from a service provider community or a stakeholder community or somebody like that, right? It's not as common, but it does happen. So are all these people going to speak the same language? No, not necessarily. Hopefully they do. That's why you want your RFP to be clear enough and explain enough, especially as somebody who's in your industry might understand a lot of your acronyms, your specific jargon. But, this was one of my jobs as a lawyer for government, saying, I don't know what this means. So you're going to have to explain it a little bit more, because all of these folks are going to have to know what that means, right? So for references, generally or often they'll ask for 2 references. Okay, again, we talk about similar services. And you want to know that they're going to say good things about you, you hope, right? At least
Are these
one
written references, or it could be either or, right?
yeah, I could.
Okay.
Usually, I believe it's not written references.
Yeah, okay.
Usually, it's just a phone number and a name and a job title.
Yep.
If it's for government, they probably want a similar thing from government or similar to government type agency, right? Has anybody had a difficult experience with references not being what they were looking for? No? Sometimes government does not want to give you reference from itself. You can see the inherent problems in that, right? If they do give you a reference, it will likely just be very factual, and some places actually they will only say, yes, these people provided this service from this date to this date. because, of course, it may get them in a situation of perceived bias or something like that. You can understand that, right? So if you can find more appropriate references, great. Sometimes you won't be able to, but they may be hesitant to give you a reference, not necessarily because of bad service provision, but because it puts them in a difficult position in terms of evaluating it and potential bias. So that's just something to understand.
So
yes.
Just with regards to like employee references,
yep.
we're all told if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything
right.
at all. If we go out and get a reference and something's bad or something bad is said about our organization and
yep.
we don't get we're not granted the RFP as a
yep.
result of that, is there any legality issues there? Is there any action that can be taken?
Probably. Am I the person to advise you on that? Not really.
Okay.
And it's a really gray area, to be honest. And that's also why government doesn't want to give references, right? For that very reason. Because it does impact. I mean, you can always look at your options for litigation or what those might be. But it's a really tough area to advise you on.
If I gave a poor reference to an employee, they didn't get an ex-employee who didn't get a job that they provided me as a reference for, they can come after our organization, they can come after me personally, right?
Yeah.
Just wondering if there's any similarities.
There's a lot of similarities, I think. So you might want to pursue that, right, if that's something you find out. But it is, tricky area. So, and again, this refers to written references. Usually they're not, but obviously you want to give a name, address, phone number, and name or title of the contact. There's no real easy, really easy solutions in the reference area. It's pretty fluid. The default wording, I just wanted you to be aware of, is that government reserves right to contact these references, the ones you gave them, and any other references without prior notification to you. Also, they reserve the right to contact any previous or current users of the service provider's products or services, including department's own personnel. So that might catch you by surprise, right? Has anybody had this happen to them? No? But just so you know, seems pretty broad. Seems quite broad, possibly overly broad to me, but that's their default. So we'll just get into some other issues. Some of the groups I think we talked a little bit about vendor meetings. Make sure you know whether it's mandatory or optional attendance, right? Because if it's mandatory, if you don't go, your proposal will also be ejected from the process. So make sure, not to mention you may not pick up key information you may need to know. So make sure you check. And there was a question over here about any questions you have about the RFP prior to the meeting. Do you have to send them prior to the meeting? No, you don't. They will be answered in a more public forum in the meeting. If you would like a particular topic discussed, maybe with your whole service provider community, that there might be some good questions to pose to have that conversation in a public forum. But you can ask questions about the RFP all the way up to the closing time of the RFP. Don't be shy. Ask more, email, you can phone them. They should all be answered by the same person, however. Risk comes in when there are multiple people answering questions, so hopefully it's the same person you're asking every time. And the general rule and the administrative fairness rule is every question that's asked has to be answered and publicly answered. So that usually means in an RFP, the question and answer have to be posted on Alberta Purchasing Connection as an addendum to an RFP. So sometimes you can go crazy because they will keep adding. Sometimes they may wait till they get several questions and answers and then do an addendum. But you'll get quite a few addendums if you're subscribed to a particular RFP. And hopefully each one makes it clearer and not more confusing. So usually at a meeting, they will also have an agenda, even if it's a loose agenda, just so everyone generally knows what's being talked about. Also, notes will be taken generally of what was discussed, not verbatim. But again, why? Because the person running the RFP wants to make sure that it is transparent and open and that everyone knows what was discussed, especially if it's an optional meeting, right? And everyone's not there. In a way, it's even more important that everyone knows what was discussed, or the general topics anyways. Okay, so yes, and sometimes they email out to everyone at the meeting the notes, that type of thing. Now, a budget can be included in an RFP or not. And it's interesting because you, as the proponent, the potential proponent, gets to think about what kind of strategy you might want to play with. Because I've seen it work out several different ways when I was in government. And so it depends. Quite often, if a budget is included, it's because those people literally don't have a penny more to spend in that area. They need you to come in under $50,000 because they know they absolutely will not be getting any more. So what would your strategy be in this case? Tell me how you're going to bid. Throw out a price you're going to give me generally.
Lower than 50,000.
Yes.
50,000.
How do you think this usually plays out when they're opening up ABC envelope?
Whoever's the cheapest?
Well, yeah, but this is generally how it looks, right? Guess what the prices are.
I was going to say.
Yeah, I was thinking about it.
Okay.
If you were smart, you're going at 49.
Exactly. Except I've also seen it work out that vendor C says, hey, I know what everybody else is going to bid. So I'm going to bid, or whatever the number is, right? Yes.
What I did once, it was really complicated once. So what I did a best case, worst case, most likely case scenario.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And what I did was I configured it so that I said these are the criteria that establish that.
Yes.
Here are the prices. And one was over,
Yep.
because it didn't have that, so
Yep.
recommended. One was under, one was right close to that.
Interesting.
But they had to see exactly what criteria were being added
Right.
or taken off.
The assumptions, right? So that's a great idea. Because again, you need to give them everything they know to compare apples to apples. Because if, once you start comparing to apples to oranges, it gets all messy and murky and
it
it
did work.
introduces risk.
And it did work.
Yeah, that's awesome. So again, remember, if they're disclosing a budget, that's likely because they can't go over. If they don't disclose the budget, what's the risk for them? Everybody goes over their invisible budget. Like say this is their budget, but they don't say. Well then, if one guy, well, this makes me laugh because I was thinking of one I did for myself. I needed someone. My company was bidding on a course redesign because I have somebody that works for me that does course redesign. But they needed some graphics and we don't have anybody that does graphics. So I asked for 3 quotes from people. One person's quote was like $1,785 or something. The other's was $2,000. And this person's quote was $27,500. So in my head, of course, the budget was like as low as possible, hopefully, right? But again, you don't know what quality these people are. But like, do you think I was in the do you think this person was completely in a different ballpark in a different city? Like if I gave them all the same scope of work and they came back with these different budgets, right? They're completely off. So the risk you run is if you don't put the budget in that everyone is going to go over usually, right? Because they won't know. Or you can say, there's different ways of talking about a budget. They could give a range. Sometimes that's how that's done. Does anybody want to offer up their experiences with budgets or how it's usually done for their particular area? Is it a range or do they often disclose budgets? Is it usually budgets? Like we have $150,000 to spend in this area? Sometimes, sometimes not. Because the other thing is you can go, you can say we anticipate we will have this much this year. But sometimes people won't know either, right? It could be because it's usually an annual budget reallocation. So there's risks to both, but you as the proposal writer, get to decide what your strategy is, right? You may bid lower because then you know you'll get in, and then usually the incumbent to the procurement will get in more easily the next time. So there's different strategy aspects you might want to think about it. Sometimes they'll give you the standardized format, like in this one I was talking about. You have to break it down in a really specific price per client price, and there's very specific formula for the price. Obviously, you want to relate your price to what is being proposed and align your funding with the amount of services required. And again, if you have a ton of questions, you have to get those all answered before you can make the finances make sense to you and then to the government. Never assume they can negotiate on price. Sometimes they might be able to a little bit, but sometimes they might not. I was involved in some where they just were told they had half the amount of money they had the day after it closed. That's a bad scenario because there's really nothing they can do about it. So depending on what the RFP asks for, again, answer in the format that they've requested. We're going to do the exercise in a minute here. I'll just take you through a few more. We're going to do some more voting reviews. Okay, what do you think? Not all RFPs have minimum scores, but if they're going to be used, they must be disclosed to the vendors. True. What did I say was the primary, well, you could say the prime directive for RFPs? Say what you're going to do and then do what you said you were going to do, right? So if you're going to use a minimum score, you have to disclose that. So it would have to be wording such as all vendors must get 50% on price or they will not proceed to the next level, right? Just make that, it has to be explicit in the RFP. Okay, what about this one? All contact with government, bad wording, but all contact with government contacts during the RFP process should be fill in the blank. Carried out at a fancy restaurant, informal with lots of opportunities for verbal interaction. Formal, limited, and documented in writing. Well, and guess who's actually in charge of this? Is it you as the vendor? No. Government has to handle this piece. And you might wish it was in a fancy restaurant, I get that. Why does it have to be formal, limited, and documented in writing? Because on the risk on their side of any perceived bias, right? Other contact after the contract is awarded, it's fine to have informal, however you want to carry on communication. But during the RFP process is particularly subject to scrutiny because why? Because government is most litigated on their process. It is the process piece that they have to make sure is absolutely squeaky clean, as clean as they can get it. What about this one? Discussing any risks you perceive in providing services to government will actually lessen potential risks to both parties. Do you agree? And I guess there's no wrong answer either, since this is your opinion. True. Generally, this is true, right? It may not work out to be true, but we did talk about risk before and how the more you know about the risks going in, then the better able both parties will be to manage it. Okay, how about this one? If you've provided the same service to government before, do you still have to include a detailed description of your experience? What do you think? Yes. Yes, you do. So you all got that one right. Again, the RFP evaluation only considers the information contained in the proposal. Now, there are some... In BC, they actually do this more. I do some training there as well for the government. However, legally, the principles are that you are limited to what is in the current proposal. You can supply references, you can talk about your experience, but you do have to keep describing. Even if you're a well-known vendor, you do have to go through the steps described, the formal steps. And the sad stories about these experiences are that sometimes a very well-known vendor that has worked with government for a long time assumes that the RFP process is a technicality and really doesn't fill out the paperwork in a very conscientious or complete way. And unfortunately, then they usually get ejected because they don't have a good proposal, even though they're a good service provider. So just be careful. Just because you're well known and you have a good relationship does not translate to the RFP process, which is a very formal legalistic process. So just keep that in mind always. Okay. Government must answer all questions forwarded by a proponent before the RFP closes. This one's easy, right? You all know the answer to this one. This is true. They have to get their, all the questions have to be answered before the RFP closes, again, because you want to make sure all the information is available to all the people. And I'm trying to remember what the deadline is. I think it's like 3 days before it's the last time they can issue an addendum. So in other words, you're not going into your final version of writing based on on something that's not true. So you need to check a few days before just to make sure that everything's still the same. Okay, any significant changes to the essential terms of the RFP should be made. And this goes to my last point. Silly example, right? Would it be awesome if there were never any changes to the RFP? Yes, it would, and we all hope for that, right? But sometimes there's no choice. A deadline may be extended, or there may be new information, or they may have to extend the term, or something essential may have to be changed in the RFP, which introduces always a certain element of risk to the government. But again, they may have no choice, or they may choose to do that anyways. So obviously the information has to get through to you, the service provider, far enough in advance so that you have time to adequately respond. And like I said, I think it's 3 days before. Okay, so you're getting ready to submit your proposal. So I'm going to get you to do exercise 3 at this point.